Near Kadesh, around 1274 BC, the Egyptian army was dangerously stretched along its line of march. Ramses II had already reached the area with the Amun division and established his camp. Behind him, the Ra division was still advancing, while Ptah and Seth remained farther south. Soldiers, supply carts, animals, officers, and supporting troops moved together along the road. Ra was not yet deployed for battle. Only hours earlier, Ramses had discovered that his intelligence was wrong. Muwatalli II was not far to the north. The Hittite army was concealed close to Kadesh. Muwatalli did not wait for all 4 Egyptian divisions to unite. A powerful Hittite chariot force crossed from the area of the Orontes and struck the marching Ra division from the flank. The target could hardly have been better. Egyptian infantry was still moving in column. Officers could not control the entire formation at once. The soldiers at the front could not clearly see what was happening behind them, while those farther back had little warning before the attack reached them. There was no complete shield line, no prepared missile screen, and no coordinated chariot force ready to answer the charge. The Hittite chariots entered the gaps between groups of troops at speed. Their effectiveness did not come from crushing everything like ancient tanks. It came from shock, movement, and surprise. Chariots cut across the marching formation, separated soldiers from their units, frightened animals, disrupted transport, and prevented officers from restoring order. Men who had been marching moments earlier were suddenly forced to fight, run, or search for companions inside a collapsing column. Ra began to break. The attack had struck precisely while the division was vulnerable between marching order and battle. Survivors fled north toward Ramses' camp, carrying panic with them. Behind them came the Hittite chariots, turning the destruction of one division into a direct threat against another. The fugitives poured into the Amun camp. Egyptian soldiers saw their comrades running through tents and vehicles while enemy chariots followed close behind. The camp itself now became an obstacle. Tents, carts, animals, and scattered equipment restricted movement, but they also made it difficult for the Egyptians to create an organized defensive line. Ramses was suddenly at the center of a crisis he had barely understood only hours before. If the Hittite chariots could preserve their speed, coordination, and momentum, the Egyptian command position itself might be overwhelmed before Ptah and Seth arrived. Muwatalli had divided the Egyptian army without first defeating it in a conventional battle. His chariots had shattered Ra and reached the pharaoh's camp. So why did an ambush that began almost perfectly fail to destroy Ramses II and end the war at Kadesh? During the 14th and 13th centuries BC, Syria became one of the great contested zones between Egypt and the Hittite Empire. This was not simply a struggle for one fortified city. The region contained trade routes, tributary kingdoms, agricultural land, and roads linking Anatolia with the Levant. Control over these corridors meant influence over local rulers and the ability to move armies north or south. By the reign of Muwatalli II, Hittite power in Syria had already been firmly established, while Egypt was attempting to push its influence northward again. Kadesh stood near the Orontes at one of the most strategically important points in this contested landscape. Whoever controlled it could influence the river valley, nearby roads, surrounding vassal kingdoms, and communication between northern and southern Syria. Seti I had previously campaigned in the region, but Hittite authority returned. When Ramses II marched north, taking Kadesh became one of the clearest ways to challenge the political system Muwatalli was defending. That distinction matters. Muwatalli did not need to conquer Egypt, march to the Nile, or destroy every soldier in Ramses' army. His strategic task was more limited. He needed to hold Kadesh, preserve the loyalty of Hittite dependence in Syria, and prevent Egypt from breaking the network that protected Hittite influence south of Anatolia. If Ramses marched north and returned without securing Kadesh, the Egyptian campaign would have failed to achieve its most important objective. The army Muwatalli assembled reflected the structure of an empire. It was not drawn only from the Hittite heartland in Anatolia. The king could call upon troops from allied and subordinate rulers across the wider Hittite system. Bringing such a force together required more than warriors. It demanded command arrangements, supply routes, grain, fodder for horses, grooms, chariot repairmen, spare equipment, knowledge of roads, and cooperation from local authorities. Such coalition armies also depended on coordination between contingents that did not all come from the same political center. Horses needed feeding and care. damaged chariots needed repair, and commanders needed information about roads and enemy movement. Kadesh offered Muwatalli a secure base from which these elements could be assembled, supplied, and directed while remaining close to the territory he intended to defend. This network gave Muwatalli access to manpower and resources far beyond a single city, but it also meant that he was defending a political system as much as a battlefield position. Losing Kadesh could weaken the confidence of nearby rulers and open the Orontes corridor to renewed Egyptian pressure. Muwatalli therefore had little reason to offer Ramses a simple battle on open ground before the Egyptian army was vulnerable. If Ramses concentrated all 4 divisions, he could deploy thousands of infantry, archers, and chariots in one coordinated force. The Hittites would then be fighting an enemy that had time to prepare. Instead, Muwatalli kept his main strength concealed near Kadesh, while Ramses received false information about the Hittite position. Egyptian accounts say that 2 Shasu men told the pharaoh that Muwatalli was still far to the north and unwilling to face him. Ramses accepted the report and continued forward before his divisions had fully concentrated. For Muwatalli, surprise was therefore not an accidental advantage. It was the key that could turn Egyptian marching order into vulnerability. He did not need a chariot that was faster than every Egyptian vehicle. He needed his chariots to appear where Egyptian soldiers were not yet ready to fight. Kadesh would be decided not by the maximum speed of a single vehicle, but by the moment when hundreds of chariots struck a division still stretched along the road. A Hittite chariot at Kadesh was not simply a wooden vehicle pulled by 2 horses. It was part of a military system. Behind every fighting crew stood grooms, wheelwrights, carpenters, armorers, supply workers, handlers, spare animals, replacement harness, and transport routes. A force numbering in the hundreds of chariots demanded enormous quantities of fodder, water, timber, leather, and maintenance. The striking power visible on the battlefield depended on an invisible logistical structure that kept horses healthy and vehicles usable. Hittite chariots at Kadesh are often reconstructed with 3 men aboard. One controlled the horses, a second served as the principal fighter, a third may have carried a shield or assisted. This 3-man arrangement is a famous feature of Hittite chariot warfare and is often contrasted with Egyptian chariots, which are commonly shown with 2-man crews. But the contrast should not be pushed too far. Not every Hittite chariot in every period must have been identical, and crew size alone did not determine battlefield effectiveness. A sturdier chariot capable of carrying 3 men offered clear advantages. The driver could focus on the horses and terrain instead of fighting. The main warrior could use a spear, strike scattered infantry, attack opposing chariot crews, or fight when the vehicle slowed. A third man could help protect the fighter with a shield, watch another direction, or support the crew in close combat. The price was additional weight. A heavier crew placed more demands on the horses and could reduce some of the maneuverability available to a lighter vehicle. Describing Hittite chariots as heavier and Egyptian chariots as lighter can be useful, but it should not become a simple formula in which one design was always slower and the other always superior. 2 horses still had to move the vehicle, crew, weapons, and equipment across real ground. That physical limitation shaped where chariots could fight effectively. They performed best on level terrain with firm soil, few deep ruts, limited mud, and enough open space to accelerate or change direction. Horses also had to remain rested enough to respond quickly. This is why the terrain around Kadesh mattered so much. Against a marching division on open ground, chariots could use speed and surprise to maximum effect. Inside a crowded camp filled with tents, wagons, animals, equipment, and frightened soldiers, the same vehicles had less room to maneuver. Hittite crews probably carried varied weapons. It is safer to imagine combinations of spears, shields, swords, or other secondary weapons, and possibly bows in some roles, than to give every warrior exactly the same equipment. Protective clothing and armor could also differ by status and function. More important than any single weapon was the way the chariot created tactical shock. It should not be imagined as a Bronze Age tank deliberately driving straight through dense ranks of infantry. Its power came from speed, horses, height, surprise, and the ability to force men to move before they could organize themselves. A fast chariot could cut between groups, attack isolated soldiers, threaten officers, and turn a loose formation into scattered pockets. That made the raw division an ideal target. its soldiers were still moving rather than waiting behind a prepared battle line. There was no complete shield wall, no fully organized missile screen, and no synchronized Egyptian chariot force ready to counterattack. Hittite vehicles could cross the column, open gaps, force soldiers away from their units, pursue men who began running, and make it difficult for officers to restore order. This was why Muwatalli's timing mattered more than the design of any single chariot. A specialized weapon system became devastating because it struck an enemy at the moment when that enemy was least able to respond. Yet the Hittite king did not immediately commit every part of his army. Egyptian records concentrate heavily on the chariot fighting, making the role of the larger Hittite infantry force difficult to reconstruct with certainty. Substantial troops appear to have remained near Kadesh, while the chariot striking force carried out the initial attack. We should therefore avoid imagining Muwatalli throwing his entire army forward in one charge. He committed a powerful mobile force while retaining strength around the city. The strengths of that force were obvious: speed, tactical shock, pursuit, mobility on open ground, and the ability to punish troops caught before deployment. Its weaknesses were just as real. Chariots depended on horses, suitable terrain, coordinated movement, skilled crews, and constant logistical support. They could lose effectiveness when drivers or horses were wounded, when individual vehicles became separated, or when crowded ground prevented them from turning. The Hittite chariot was devastating when it could move as part of a coordinated formation. The danger began when success carried those vehicles away from open ground and into a battlefield where movement, spacing, and control became increasingly difficult. Ramses II approached Kadesh with an army divided into 4 divisions named Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Seth. He marched with Amun at the front, while the other divisions followed south along the route. The spacing was not reckless. Large Bronze Age armies needed room to move, forage, manage animals, and avoid blocking the road. But the distance between the divisions became dangerous because they could not support one another immediately if attacked. Near Kadesh, 2 Shasu men were brought before Ramses. According to the Egyptian accounts, they told him that Muwatalli II was afraid to face the Egyptians and that the Hittite army remained far to the north. Ramses accepted the information and continued forward, believing the main enemy force was still distant. The story comes from Egyptian royal texts, so its presentation must be treated carefully. Yet those same sources make one point unmistakable. Ramses believed the Hittites were farther away than they actually were. Soon afterward, other captives were brought in and questioned. They revealed that Muwatalli and his army were not far away at all. They were concealed near Kadesh, close enough to strike before the Egyptian divisions had concentrated. Ramses understood the scale of the danger. He summoned officers, rebuked those responsible for reconnaissance, and sent messengers south to accelerate the approach of Ptah and Seth. Amun had to be prepared around the camp, while warnings needed to reach Ra, still marching toward the pharaoh. But Muwatalli had created a problem that could not be solved simply by issuing faster orders. The Egyptian army existed as 4 divisions on the road, not yet as one army on the battlefield. Ra was now the exposed link. Muwatalli did not give Ramses time to repair the situation. A Hittite chariot force moved across the river area and struck the Ra division from the side while it was still advancing. The attack exploited exactly what the deception had created: distance between Egyptian formations, incomplete battle deployment, and a target unable to receive rapid support from either direction. The initial blow achieved several effects at once. It separated Amun from the divisions farther south. It disrupted Ra before that division could enter the main battle. And as soldiers from Ra began fleeing toward Ramses, their retreat carried disorder into the Amun camp. This was more sophisticated than simply sending fast chariots against slower infantry. Muwatalli was using a mobile striking force against an enemy whose march had created temporary gaps in command, formation, and mutual support. The first stage was an ambush. The next became a pursuit. As Hittite chariots chased survivors from Ra toward the Egyptian camp, the nature of the battlefield began to change. Vehicles that had attacked across open ground now followed fugitives into an area filled with tents, carts, animals, equipment, and dense groups of soldiers. The chariot formation itself could become less orderly. Distances between vehicles changed as individual crews avoided obstacles or followed different targets. Some Egyptian texts accuse Hittite warriors of becoming distracted by plunder inside the camp. That claim may reflect royal propaganda and should not be treated as certain, but it captures a broader tactical problem. The attackers were moving deeper into a crowded environment where maintaining formation was increasingly difficult. Muwatalli had achieved what few enemies of Egypt could hope to accomplish. One division had been broken while marching. Another was trapped in a camp suddenly flooded with fugitives and enemy chariots. Ramses himself was dangerously exposed before the rest of his army had arrived. Yet the same momentum that carried the Hittite attack into the camp began to weaken the conditions that had made it so effective. The battle was shifting from a controlled ambush on open ground into a chaotic struggle among tents, wagons, horses, soldiers, and scattered chariots. Muwatalli had sprung the trap almost perfectly. Now he had to turn surprise into destruction before Ramses could recover. At Kadesh, the Hittite chariots followed the broken survivors of Ra directly into the Amun camp. At first, the situation still favored Muwatalli. Egyptian soldiers were running, defensive order was incomplete, and the camp had not been prepared to absorb an attack from fast-moving vehicles. Ramses himself was dangerously exposed. If the Egyptian command structure collapsed here, the divisions still approaching from the south might arrive without coordination, leadership, or a clear picture of the battlefield. But the environment inside the camp was very different from the open ground where Ra had been struck. Tents, supply wagons, animals, equipment, frightened soldiers, and Egyptian chariots created obstacles everywhere. Vehicles designed to maneuver at speed now had to slow, turn, separate, and choose individual paths through congestion. Egyptian royal text transformed the next phase into a heroic story centered almost entirely on Ramses. In these accounts, the pharaoh is abandoned, calls upon Amun, and then personally destroys enormous numbers of enemies. That image should not be read literally. Ramses still had guards, officers, surviving troops from Amun, chariot crews, men from Ra, and other forces around the camp. What can be said more safely is that the Egyptians recovered enough organization to counterattack. That recovery mattered because the Hittite chariots were no longer moving as one coherent striking formation. Some vehicles had pushed farther into the camp than others. Crews had to avoid obstacles, follow fleeing enemies, or turn toward new threats. Egyptian sources also accuse Hittite warriors of stopping to plunder the camp. That detail may serve the propaganda of Ramses and cannot be treated as certain. But the wider tactical problem is clear. The attackers had become dispersed. Now Egyptian chariots and organized groups of infantry had new opportunities. Instead of facing a synchronized wave on open ground, they could attack isolated vehicles, target horses and drivers, shoot at exposed crews, and avoid whatever Hittite groups still remained concentrated. A weapon system optimized for speed, shock, and disruption was now being forced into a fragmented fight where movement was restricted and coordination became harder. At this critical stage, another force entered the battle. Egyptian records refer to reinforcements called the Ni'arin, or Na'arn. Their exact identity remains debated. They may have been Egyptian troops, allied forces connected with Amuru, or a contingent whose precise status is no longer recoverable from the surviving evidence. It is therefore safer to describe them simply as a reinforcing force known in the Egyptian record as the Na'arin. Their arrival increased pressure on the Hittite chariots already deep inside or around the camp. Egyptian resistance was no longer limited to whatever Ramses had immediately around him. Muwatalli now faced a rapidly changing situation. Amun was recovering. Ra had been badly disrupted but not annihilated. The Na'arin had arrived. Ptah was drawing closer. Hittite chariots that had begun the battle in coordinated formations were now scattered across a crowded battlefield. The ambush of an isolated division was becoming a larger confrontation against increasing numbers of Egyptian troops. This raises one of the most important questions of Kadesh. Why did Muwatalli not commit all his remaining forces at the moment Ramses appeared most vulnerable? He may have needed substantial forces to protect Kadesh itself. He may have been unwilling to risk his infantry reserve before understanding the situation. Dust, confusion, distance, and the speed of the fighting may have made it difficult to know how close Ramses was to collapse. Muwatalli also knew that other Egyptian divisions were approaching from the south, and moving large infantry forces across or around the river area would require time and coordination. It is also possible that the chariot attack lost coherence faster than expected, leaving too little time to exploit the breakthrough before Egyptian resistance hardened. Because the surviving narrative is overwhelmingly Egyptian, we do not possess Muwatalli's own operational explanation. Turning his decision into a simple story of cowardice or incompetence would therefore go beyond the evidence. Egyptian tradition describes further Hittite chariot attacks, but the decisive advantage of the first assault had already vanished. Surprise was gone. The Egyptians now knew where the enemy was coming from. They had troops forming inside and around the camp. Their chariots could respond. Reinforcements were arriving. Soldiers who had been shocked by the collapse of Ra were no longer facing an enemy that appeared without warning. A tactic that devastated a marching division could not produce the same effect against troops that were alert and increasingly organized. The Hittite attack therefore began to lose momentum. Vehicles were pushed or drawn away from the camp, and the Egyptians recovered enough control to prevent the destruction of Ramses and his headquarters. Eventually, the Hittite forces withdrew from the immediate battlefield toward Kadesh and the Orontes area. Ramses had survived, but survival was not the same as strategic victory. The Egyptians did not capture Kadesh. They did not destroy Muwatalli's army. They did not break the Hittite political system in Syria. The pharaoh had escaped a disaster and restored his army's ability to fight, but the original objective of the campaign remained beyond his grasp. Muwatalli, for his part, had failed to convert one of the most successful ambushes of the Bronze Age into the destruction of the Egyptian field army. His chariots had broken Ra, penetrated Amun's camp, and brought Ramses dangerously close to catastrophe. Yet once the attackers entered confined ground, lost coordination, and faced fresh opposition, the conditions that had created their success disappeared. Muwatalli had failed to destroy Ramses. Ramses had failed to take Kadesh. The Hittite ambush lost its opportunity for a decisive tactical victory, but the strategic objective Muwatalli had come to defend remained in Hittite hands. Ramses II did not allow Kadesh to be remembered as a failure. After returning to Egypt, he had accounts of the battle carved on temple walls and monuments across his kingdom. In these versions, Egyptian officers fail, soldiers flee, and the pharaoh stands almost alone. Ramses calls upon Amun, receives divine strength, counterattacks, and destroys masses of Hittite enemies. Muwatalli is presented as frightened and eventually seeking peace. These texts, including versions often called the Poem and the Bulletin, are among the most famous examples of royal military propaganda from the ancient world. They are invaluable sources, but they were designed to celebrate Ramses, not to provide a neutral battlefield report. The central problem with the claim of total Egyptian victory is simple: Kadesh did not become Egyptian. Ramses did not capture the city. Muwatalli was not overthrown. The Hittite army was not destroyed, and Hittite influence in Syria remained strong. The political balance Ramses had intended to overturn therefore remained intact after the fighting ended. Egypt had survived the battle, recovered from the shock of the ambush, and prevented the destruction of the pharaoh's army, but it had failed to achieve the main objective of the campaign. That does not mean Muwatalli won a complete victory either. His chariot attack shattered the Ra division, penetrated the Amun camp, and brought Ramses dangerously close to disaster. Yet the Hittites did not kill or capture the pharaoh, destroy all 4 Egyptian divisions, or turn the ambush into the annihilation of the invading army. The most balanced conclusion is therefore that the battle itself was tactically inconclusive. Strategically, however, the Hittites achieved the more important immediate objective because Kadesh remained outside Egyptian control. Kadesh also reveals both the strength and the limitations of Bronze Age chariot warfare. Used on suitable ground, at the right moment, against troops that had not fully deployed, chariots could create catastrophic disorder within minutes. Speed, surprise, and coordination made them terrifying. But those advantages were conditional. Once vehicles moved too deeply into confined ground, lost formation, faced organized resistance, and encountered fresh enemy forces, their effectiveness declined quickly. The chariot was not an ancient tank. It was a specialized weapon system whose power depended on movement, spacing, horses, and timing. The battle did not immediately produce lasting peace. Years later, under Ramses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III, Egypt and Hatti concluded the famous peace agreement that formalized a new relationship between the two powers. Kadesh was therefore part of a much longer struggle before diplomacy finally replaced repeated attempts to dominate Syria. Muwatalli did not nearly defeat Egypt because he possessed a magical or invincible chariot. He nearly defeated Ramses because he created the right moment for chariots to strike. His deception stretched the Egyptian army apart. His mobile force hit Ra before it could deploy. His chariots reached the pharaoh's camp before the remaining divisions could intervene. But the breakthrough could not be converted into complete destruction. Ramses survived, yet he did not take Kadesh. Muwatalli missed a decisive tactical victory, yet he retained the strategic objective he had come to defend. Kadesh was therefore both the triumph and the limitation of Bronze Age chariot warfare, devastating when surprise, terrain, formation, and timing worked together, but unable to guarantee victory once those conditions disappeared.